Meanwhile, a homeless man, Hwang, who everyone thought was already dead, entered the room. He looked at Yeon-woo. Perhaps the man had heard everything the teenagers were talking about. The man was looking at the boy and analyzing him. It seemed that he wanted to ask him something. Meanwhile, the teenagers and Hwang moved back to their temporary shelter. The homeless man was commenting on the brain tumor that was in the body of the man who burned down. He said it was normal for homeless people. After all, it was very common for people without a permanent place of residence to get sick with various sores. Hwang added that when they were sick, they had to sleep on the street. Someone said that the man was poor because he had to sleep on the street. Isuri was listening, but she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. She turned her attention to Yeon-woo. The boy slung the briefcase over his shoulder again and walked toward the exit, head down. Hwang asked if it turned out that the part of the body where the tumor was not contagious at all. He laughed and said it was very interesting. Suddenly the homeless man said it was time for him to go. He turned to Jeon-woo and called out to the boy. This made everyone present look at him. The homeless man approached Jeon-woo and asked if he could help him. Of course, the teenager answered positively. Then the boy would come out and look at his classmates out of the corner of his eye. He understood what they were all thinking, and he knew that as soon as the teenager walked out the door, they would all start discussing him. They all stood and looked down. Only Isuri was brave enough to look Jeon-woo in the eye. It was all very awkward. The boy understood everything without words. Jeon-woo knew that he had to leave the room because his classmates would be afraid of the boy and would not want him with them at all. Perhaps they could even betray him again during the danger, and Jeon-woo really did not want to go through that again. Hwen, a homeless man, asked the teenager to just walk him to the canteen. It was very difficult for him to walk because of the many injuries he had suffered from other homeless people. As soon as Yeon-woo closed the door behind him, Ham Sung-gyu began to get indignant and discuss what the zombie monster had said. The boy was just shouting that Yeon-woo was infected. Ham Sung-gyu didn't like the teenager, so he easily believed everything the zombie monster said. The guy started swearing that it was now an official statement, and they were all in danger. He added that they almost didn't die. Ham Sung-gyu said that from now on, if any of his classmates approached Yeon-woo or touched him, the teenager would slap that person in the face. So-yeon felt guilty. She was already constantly thinking about how she was useless and a burden to everyone, and now she had touched Yeon-woo, so she could probably be infected. But So-young didn't let on. She didn't want to rush things. The fact that Yeon-woo was a threat had not been proven. Suddenly, Isuri asked Kang-min what he thought about Yeon-woo. Meanwhile, the boy was looking out the window, and the girl was as stony-faced as ever. Kang-min did not miss the opportunity to make fun of Isuri and make an ironic comment about how it was very unusual for a girl to ask his opinion. Of course, Isuri fell for this provocation and irritably told Kang-min to just answer already. The guy suddenly became very serious. He said he didn't know for sure, but as far as he knew, according to his hypothesis about cancer cells, this could not simply be the case. After all, cancer could be completely cured. Meanwhile, in the dining room, homeless people were lying on the tables. There were 2 of them in the room. Suddenly, someone called out to them, and then the men raised their heads. It was Hwang and Yeon-woo, who was holding the man because he was limping. Hwang said the homeless people looked happy. The 2 homeless men were genuinely surprised to see Hwang alive. One of them even started to sign in, but they both tried to put on a friendly face, as if they were happy to see the man. Hwang called them assholes, and asked if these rats were trying to take his side now. The men immediately started apologizing to Hwang and blaming their boss, calling him an idiot. Another began to thank the man for opening the door for them. Without him, they would not have survived. Hwang did not react much to this scene of the 2 victims. He just said he was glad the 2 of them realized it. And then the homeless man asked where the others were. One of the men said that they did not know where everyone was, and that they only said that the shelter was sharing some supplies. Then, the homeless man said that the boss and other homeless people had gone there. For some reason, this information surprised Yeon-woo. His face clearly showed shock. Meanwhile, there were many soldiers from the army in the shelter tent. One of them was saluting another and telling him something. Homeless people were kneeling on the floor with their hands behind their heads. All the soldiers were holding weapons. The boss and another homeless man were indignant, saying that they shouldn't have come here at all. The man said that he was very scared because he could have been shot. Suddenly, one of the soldiers said that strange people kept coming to the shelter. The boss of the homeless heard this. The man in uniform reported to his commander that he was the one who spoke about these homeless people. Meanwhile, the classmates continued to discuss Yeon-woo and what they should do with him. Suddenly, So-yeon spoke up. She looked at the floor and looked guilty. The girl said that even if it was true, how could they just label Yeon-woo as infected? She added that Yeon-woo hadn't shown any suspicious symptoms yet, which didn't give them the right to just brand the boy. And it was not wise to believe a zombie monster. It seems that Isuri and Kang-min thought about the girl's words, but Ham Sung-yu had a different opinion. He exploded and shouted that Yeon-woo had a bunch of suspicious symptoms. The guy was just beside himself with anger. He shouted that almost everything about him was suspicious. The guy shouted at So-yeon that he promised to kill anyone who touched Yeon-woo. Ham Sung-yu added that he wasn't joking at all. So-yeon's face suddenly changed dramatically. The girl decided to come clean and said that they had been together for some time and that she hadn't noticed or experienced any problems until now. If Jeonwoo was infected, something would have happened by now, but Ham Sung-yu just laughed at her. He looked down and adjusted his glasses, telling Park So-young that this was exactly what happened, and something was already happening. He looked down at the girl and added that this was why So-young shouldn't have defended Yeon-woo too much. The way the girl was doing. Suddenly, the teenagers heard a strange sound of wheels. All four turned to see what it was. Kang-min and Isuri went to the window because they were closest to it. Outside the window, they saw many military vehicles approaching them. There were 4 of them. Kang-min was surprised to see this. He didn't think it was good news. All the cars were parked near the building where the teenagers were. Later, uniformed soldiers with machine guns started coming out. Kang-min cursed. Ham Sung-yu and Kang-min looked through the door and asked what they were supposed to do. This army had recently wanted to burn them alive, and now they had come right to this room where they were all hiding. So-yeon and Isuri were at the window and suggested that the boys go out through it to save themselves. But when the boys were running, they said that the window was too narrow and they would not fit through. Then the girls offered to break the window. Ham Sung-yu, of course, cried and said that the girls could break the window. Kang-min remembered that they had emergency hammers. He would definitely give one to Seo-young. She started to take it out of her bag. Ham Sung-yu interfered and yelled at them to do it faster. The 2 guys had 2 hammers each. They started breaking windows to get through them. Suddenly, So-yeon remembered something very important. Her eyes widened again, and her heart started to race. It was as if she was experiencing a kind of déjà vu. She suddenly gathered courage and shouted for everyone to stop. Then the girl asked what they had forgotten about Yeonwa. Kang-min stopped and looked back. Ham Sung-yu continued to break the glass. So-young looked down at the stairs and said that Yeon-woo wasn't here, hinting that this was a problem. The girl added that she had to find him. Otherwise, if he was left alone, the soldiers would notice him. When Ham Sung-yu heard this, a vein stood out on his face and he was furious. Suddenly, he yelled at So-yeon. She turned to him and saw the following picture. The guy took a swing at the glass. He decided not to be petty and break everything. The glass immediately broke and its particles flew down, making a lot of noise. The military definitely heard this and were running toward the sound. Ham Sung-yu did not think for a second and climbed out the window to escape. He didn't even turn to Seo-young and say whether she wanted to attract attention for some Lee Yeon-woo who was infected at all. Ham Sung-yu added that the soldiers would then capture them all without exception. Finally, the boy turned to the girl and asked if she was willing to take the risk and take responsibility for it. In the end, Ham Sung-yu added that someone had to survive. After that, the guy jumped out of the window. Kang-min immediately followed him. He told Seo-young to get away quickly because the soldiers were getting closer and closer. They had little time left. But the girl didn't even move. She was screaming and didn't know what to do. So-young didn't want to leave Jeonhwa again and betray him, especially since he was under suspicion. Suddenly, someone approached So-yeon. It was Isuri. She asked if the girl was okay. She said that So-yeon would not have had the courage to take the risk. Isuri was rude. She spoke clearly and even with a touch of humiliation. She told So-yeon to calm down because it was impossible to help others. After these words, Isuri climbed out the window. So-yeon just stood there and watched her classmates run away. They shouted at her to run faster, but So-yeon stood there. She could not make up her mind and did not know what to do. She wanted to help her friend Yeon-woo, but she didn't want to die either. Her classmates were right. So-young was not brave at all. Suddenly, Isuri realized that her classmate had stayed behind and had not climbed out the window. She turned to see what had happened. She saw So-yeon standing in the window, watching her classmates run away. Isuri then shouted at So-yeon that she was crazy, that she should have run away with them all. The girl clenched her fist. There was a storm inside her that was tearing her apart. She looked at the window. In a few seconds, So-yeon would have been running away with her classmates. But she realized that everything was exactly the same then. She did not want to betray Yeonhwa again. It broke her heart. She remembered when her classmates were running away from the Namsan cable car. At the last moment, she looked toward the room. In the window, she saw Yeonhwa, whom they had all just abandoned. She suddenly realized that she could not make the same mistake again. So-yeon had to go to Jeon-woo and run away with him. Suddenly, memories of the field trip came to mind. Then So-yeon heard her classmates putting on makeup in the restroom and talking about how the girl was trying to be cute on purpose. They were making fun of their friend. So-yeon heard all this and felt very uncomfortable. She heard one of her classmates say that she hoped So-yeon would die, and another classmate laughed at her. These memories brought her terrible pain. She dropped her head and sank into herself for a second. Suddenly, she heard someone run in and ask her what happened. It was Lee Yeon-woo. He came running downstairs and said he heard the sound of glass breaking. So-yeon was very happy to see her classmate. He looked at the girl. She looked bad and was all alone. The boy saw the broken glass and asked why the girl was alone and where all the other classmates were. So-yeon shouted that they had to get out of the room as quickly as possible. Right now. Suddenly her expression changed dramatically. The girl's eyes widened greatly and her pupils narrowed. Behind the boy's back, So-yeon saw an army of soldiers enter the room with assault rifles and point their muzzles at the teenagers. Yeon-woo saw the expression on his classmate's face and turned his head to see what was wrong. His face suddenly became frightened. For a second, Yeon-woo thought it was the end. The events moved to a shelter. They went into a tent that was fenced off and guarded by a soldier. Inside it was Park Min. He was sitting on a chair wearing a mask and texting with someone on his phone. The guy's correspondent said that Park Min was trapped. He asked the other person how he was doing, and he replied that everything depended on Park Min. He wondered why he was being protected by soldiers with weapons, or maybe they were protecting him. Suddenly, Park Min heard that the soldier standing in front of the boy's tent was asked if he had been following him. Park Min turned toward the sound and suddenly realized that they also suspected him of being infected. Suddenly, the guy had a terrible feeling. He felt pain all over his body and his consciousness seemed to become unreal. Park Min screamed in pain. Of course, the soldier on duty at the tent heard this and immediately reacted. 2 soldiers went inside to see Park Min. The boy was shaking all over, but he pulled himself together and said that he was fine, although his voice said otherwise. Cold sweat dripped down Park Min's face, and he was feverish. He didn't understand why he was in so much pain. His arm was all stiff. He felt a sharp pain in the middle. Suddenly, Park Min remembered how Yeon-woo had told him in the shelter when they were running away that the boy was infected, and the virus was about to mutate. Park Min couldn't believe it. He couldn't be infected. The guy fell to the ground from his chair. He looked down and told the soldiers that he was fine. Park Min was afraid that he would have been burned to death right then and there. He nervously argued that everything was fine, and that he just needed to rest and go to bed. Park Min gathered his thoughts and looked at the soldiers and managed to force a smile. But the soldiers saw that cold sweat was dripping down his face. The teenager looked very unhealthy. He said that the military were free to leave and had nothing to worry about. But of course they didn't believe him. The men pointed their guns at Park Min. He fell down and started crawling back, begging the soldiers to wait and not kill him. Park Min shouted for them to stop, and that there was nothing in his behavior that indicated the boy was not infected. The teenager's heart was leaping out of his chest. He realized that he was about to die. One of the soldiers pointed the muzzle of his assault rifle at the boy and said that the other one went to report the situation to the commander. Park Min suddenly realized that he was finished. The soldiers did not believe the teenager. Suddenly, a guy entered the room and interrupted Park Min's execution. It was a red-haired guy named Lee Tae-in. He came in and asked the soldiers if he could see Park Min. He added that he wanted to know what happened to his friend. He acted so arrogantly, as if he were omnipotent. He walked in and approached Park Min. The boy looked at Lee Tien with a scared look. The red-headed guy said it wasn't that bad. And then he added that he had to talk to Park Min. Lee Tae-in had a smile on his face, as if the whole situation brought him joy. The soldier began to get indignant and asked who this guy was and why he came here. He began to threaten him if Lee Tae-in did not leave the tent immediately. But the soldier did not have time to finish. His friend interrupted the soldier. The soldier ordered them to leave. The other soldier was outraged, but his comrade called him an asshole and repeated the order to leave. Lee Tae-in just stood there smiling the whole time. He was genuinely laughing at the whole thing. The red-haired guy just smiled at the military, but something in his smile was frightening and unpleasant. In general, this man was quite repulsive. Then Lee Tae-in came closer to Park Min when the soldiers came out of the tent. He was on the floor and did not understand what was happening and how the soldiers had obeyed him so easily. The red-haired guy spoke first because Park Min was in a stupor and couldn't say a word. Lee Tae-in asked if they had met him before. Park Min remained silent. So the man continued to ask questions and at the same time put a chair in place for him to sit on. Lee Tae-kyung asked Park Min what was happening to his body and if he felt nauseous. But the bold Park Min wasn't going to make new friends that easily. He asked Lee Tae-in who he was and how he knew about Park Min, And in his mind, the teenager was thinking about the fact that Lee Tae-in was not wearing a mask. This fear in his voice amused the red-headed boy. A smile appeared on his face, which was more like a grin. Lee Tae-in said that he was the one who could help Park Min. Meanwhile, the man had already sat down on the chair where the teenager had been sitting before. He looked up at the boy, as if to make it clear that he was in charge, and Lee Tae-in should be listened to. Meanwhile, Yeon-woo, So-yeon, and 3 homeless men sat on the floor with their hands behind their heads as if they were about to be shot. Several soldiers stood near them. One of them was pointing at the company and ordering his partner to contact headquarters. The soldier added that he should find the other suspects through his connection to headquarters. His partner accepted the command and left. Yeon-woo and So-yeon were scared. Cold sweat was pouring down their faces. Yeon-woo asked the girl if the others had just run away. So-yeon understood this as a rhetorical question and asked what they should have done. But the guy did not answer. He felt really bad. He knew that if the military had noticed how the boy reacted to the zombie monsters, they would have killed him on the spot. No one would have dealt with him. Yeon-woo mentally reassured himself. He thought that if they were not all infected, then everything would be just fine and they would survive. Suddenly someone spoke to the military. His manner of communication left much to be desired. He was a homeless man wearing a hat and a red jacket. He stood up and started shouting indignantly at the soldiers. He asked what was going on here. Another homeless man tried to calm down his friend, who was more daring than he was. But the man in the hat turned to his friend and told him to let him go. The homeless man continued to shout at the soldiers. He asked why the soldiers were intimidating civilians. And then, the man switched to the mat and called the soldiers bastards. Then, one of the soldiers took an assault rifle and pointed the muzzle at the homeless man. This did not stop the man. He began to approach the soldiers and aggressively asked them how many more divisions they had and where the other freaks were. The homeless man behaved inappropriately, as if he were drunk. The soldier gave the man one last chance and ordered him to immediately step back. But the homeless man did not listen and continued to call the soldiers names. The man started a sentence that implied threats, but could not finish. Suddenly, a loud shot was heard. So-yeon even covered her ears with her hands because she expected it to be loud. The soldier began to comment on his actions. But he explained to his partner that they all had a permit to shoot. If the suspected infected person was approaching, they could shoot him for safety reasons. Yeon-woo took his hands away from his head in fear. No one expected a soldier to just shoot an innocent homeless man. It was someone else's life. What did the soldiers think of themselves? That they gave themselves the right to take someone's life? Then, his partner asked the soldier if all the suspects were infected. The man would shoot them all, but there was no answer, and the soldier realized that the question was unnecessary. But it was too late. When Yeon-woo heard about it, he felt very sick. He turned his head and saw the corpse of a homeless man lying dead on the floor. Blood was pouring out of his head, and there was a lot of it. Yeon-woo saw with his own eyes how a living person was killed. Not an infected zombie monster, but an innocent man. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by the military. One of them pointed a machine gun at Yeon-woo and asked him where he was with his friends. Yeon-woo panicked so much that he started waving his hands in front of his face. He thought for a second that they were going to shoot him too. For some reason, Yeon-woo's reaction surprised the man, and he asked why the boy jumped. Yeon-woo stammered and replied that he did not know why this had happened. It was clear that he was scared to death. The teenager was afraid that they would shoot, and began to justify himself by saying that he really did not know why he reacted that way. Another soldier laughed. He found it funny that a teenager was afraid of soldiers with guns who could just shoot innocent people because they saw them as an imaginary danger. But Yeon-woo could think of nothing else but the muzzle that the soldier was still pointing at the boy, and the corpse of the homeless man lying next to him, bleeding. The teenager's eyes widened sharply, and his pupils shrank. Cold sweat dripped down his face, and his heart was beating fast. The boy thought that he was going to die and be shot by these scum who were hiding behind the uniform and the government. Yeon-woo felt the soldier's finger go down on the trigger of the machine gun. He began to press it a little. The man asked if the teenager could not simply answer his question. Yeon-woo was so scared that he could see a white leash in front of his eyes. He could not think about anything but the muzzle of the gun that was about to shoot him. The guy was in a stupor and silent. Suddenly, the young man screamed and lowered his head, holding it with his hands. The teenager was very scared. The soldiers were watching. They were shocked. A man with an assault rifle asked what was happening to Yeon-woo, but the guy did not answer. His consciousness was not with him now. Yeon-woo did not understand what was happening at all, and just held his head with his hands. The military asked him again what was happening to him. The boy's eyes were swimming. He could only see their feet and heard the man with the machine gun ask if the boy was so scared that he was behaving like that. His partner replied that it looked like he was. Jeon-woo did not understand what was happening to him. He thought his head was about to explode. Everything was still swimming before his eyes. So-yeon was watching. The girl covered her mouth with her hands in fear. She asked if Yeon-woo was okay, and then she asked what had happened to him. The soldiers left the teenagers and walked away, realizing that they would be useless now. The soldier asked his partner what they should have done with them, and suggested quarantining them all. But the man did not receive an answer. He turned his head to the other side of the street. There were several other soldiers standing near a building. The soldier turned his head because something caught his attention. He told his commander to come back and see something. There was fear in the soldier's voice. He was frightened by what he had just seen. The commander was irritated and returned with aggression, but his anger quickly turned to fear. When the man turned his head, he saw a large army of zombie monsters coming out of the road. There were a lot of them, and they were all running toward them. Perhaps the zombie monsters had heard the sound of the gunshot, and so ran. Meanwhile, in the tent, Park Min and Lee Tae-in were talking. The boy did not believe that the red-headed savior could help him. Lee Tae-in asked with a smile what was wrong. He could see from Park Min's expression that he didn't believe him. So Lee Tae-in decided to ask him directly. Then the man smiled even wider and asked if Park Min needed help now. Lee Tae-in suddenly said that he was helping people like Park Min. He added that he meant the infected. These words sent shivers down the teenager's spine. How could the red-haired boy know that he was infected? Park Min pulled himself together and said it was great. The guy suddenly started to get up and said that Lee Tae-in had suddenly appeared and started saying something so incredible. He sounded like he was mocking me, but the red-haired guy didn't get out of character and kept smiling at Park Min. He just asked what the guy meant. Park Min stood up and shouted at the boy. He asked him if he was in league with those soldiers, and then he asked if Lee Tae-in really believed that Park Min would not have guessed. The teenager was very aggressive. Even if Lee Tae-in had been with the military and didn't know for sure that the boy was infected, Park Min's behavior gave him away. The boy began to ask if Lee Tae-in had any proof that Park Min was infected. Then, the teenager began to threaten his father. Lee Tae-in had a full mouth and puffy cheeks. Park Min continued to talk and threaten his father, saying that he was in charge of the Daesan clinic in Cheonan. He started to threaten that when he returned home. But the boy did not have time to finish. Suddenly, Lee Tae-in could not help himself. A wave of laughter erupted from his mouth. Park Min looked at the guy, and his face showed complete incomprehension. The red-haired guy grabbed his head and laughed out loud. He couldn't just hold back his emotions. In a burst of laughter, he asked Park Min what kind of nonsense he had just said. Lee Tae-in even had tears in his eyes. He kept laughing and then apologized for interrupting and told Park Min to go ahead and finish what he was going to do to him. But the teenager did not understand what was happening. He looked at Lee Tae-in and remained silent. The red-headed boy looked at Park Min and said that he was very funny. Suddenly, Lee Tae-in stood up because he had already calmed down. He looked at Park Min directly into his eyes and started talking. Lee Tae-in suddenly pointed his index finger at Park Min and pointed to his stomach. Suddenly, the teenager shook all over. He did not understand what was happening to him. A sharp and terrible pain went through his entire body, as if a million needles were being inserted into him at the same time. Park Min immediately fell to the floor and clutched his stomach. The sight was terrifying and even humiliating. The teenager was moaning and screaming in pain. Lee Tae-in started laughing at Park Min and asked what was wrong with the boy. The teenager begged him to stop doing that, but the red-haired guy didn't show any sympathy. His face was very calm and relaxed, as if he didn't have a guy screaming like hell next to him. Lee Tae-in said he would help Park Min, but only if he agreed with him. Park Min was hardly crying. His eyes began to water. He couldn't even say anything because of the intense pain he was in. The guy looked at the soldiers and could not understand why they were just standing there doing nothing. The soldiers were completely unresponsive to what was happening in the ward. Park Min became even more afraid of Lee Tae-in if he was able to control the military. Lee Tae-in walked down to Park Min and put his hand on his back as if to show support. The red-haired boy talked about what he liked to watch, but he didn't say what he liked to watch. Park Min couldn't resist asking what Lee Tae-in liked to look at. The red-haired boy had this wide and crazy smile on his face. It was even more frightening. Lee Tae-in looked Park Min in the eye and asked him if he wanted to get better. Park Min could not speak. He was in so much pain, he couldn't even lift his head and kept looking down at the floor. Meanwhile, Lee Tae-in continued to mock the teenager and asked him if he liked what he was feeling. He laughed at the boy and asked if Park Min wanted to go home. He added another question, asking if the teenager thought he could get out of Seoul. Then he laughed out loud and said that the fool was very wrong. Lee Tae-kyung stooped down to Park Min and asked him with a smile what he had decided. Meanwhile, things were no better in Seoul and Yeon-woo. The soldiers began to burn the zombie monster army that wanted to attack them. Huge, ugly giants were coming from all sides. There were more of them than the monsters themselves. Suddenly, the soldier asked his commander if he had noticed correctly that the zombie monsters were coming from the quarantine zone. Zombie monsters ran out of the doors of a large room one after another. It was as if someone was controlling them all. Behind the soldiers were teenagers and homeless people. They continued to sit on the floor. Yeon-woo still felt sick and was breathing deeply and loudly. The soldier shouted that zombie monsters were everywhere. Suddenly, Hwang began to realize that they would not all be able to escape and survive. There were too many zombie monsters, and the military couldn't handle them all. The homeless man shouted to So-yeon and called out to the girl. He suddenly began to lift her up and told the teenagers to get up, because they all needed to save themselves. Meanwhile, one of the soldiers' guns stopped emitting flames. It looks like the fuel simply ran out. The man noticed this and was in a stupor for a few seconds, not realizing what had happened. These few minutes were enough time for a zombie monster to suddenly appear out of nowhere and attack the soldier. The man screamed. His eyes widened and his pupils constricted. He realized that he had no way to escape and was about to be eaten by a hideous zombie monster. Meanwhile, the teenagers and homeless people had already gotten up and started running away. There were only 4 of them. The soldiers did not even notice them because they were busy with their own business. Yeon-woo still couldn't fully recover. His eyes were swimming. Hwang noticed this, but he kept him safe. He shouted at him to run faster, but for some reason Yeon-woo looked back. Something made him do it. The teenager saw a picture where a zombie monster attacked a soldier and started eating him. The commander, who was nearby, just looked on in stupor as his partner was being devoured. The zombie monster almost completely enveloped the soldier, although he tried to escape. The commander just closed his eyes. It was hard for him to watch. It's strange that it was not hard for him to watch him shoot innocent people in the head. The soldier took one last look at his commander, who had closed his eyes. The tentacles of a zombie monster had already managed to crawl under his helmet on his head. The team finally opened its eyes. It looked like he was about to cry. Tears flowed from the soldier's eyes. Almost his entire face was covered with white mucus and the frog egg virus. The commander gathered his thoughts and shot the soldier with his assault rifle. Suddenly, a soldier standing next to him told the commander that if he did that, it would be murder. It seems that the military had their own classification, and shooting an innocent homeless man in the head was not considered murder for them. Suddenly, the commander heard someone screaming and rushing someone. He looked up to see what was happening. Then he saw that their suspects were simply running away from them. The company turned a corner. They all ran as fast as they could and shouted loudly. But some people in the company slowed down the whole process. The homeless man again noticed that Yeon-woo was weak and could barely move his legs. He asked the teenager what was wrong with him. Cold sweat was pouring down his face. He was breathing very loudly and deeply. It seemed that the teenager was about to fall over. Yeon-woo stopped and put his head down. He just couldn't run anymore. It was too hard for him. He told the others to run forward without him. The group turned their heads to see what was happening to Yeon-woo. So-yeon began to care about her classmate the most. The teenager was breathing very loudly, as if he was short of breath. He repeated that they should go on without him, and that he was fine. But So-yeon was outraged because she saw that it wasn't true. She was angry that she had stayed with him in the shelter, only to have him leave her. Yeon-woo watched the view and took deep breaths to regain his composure. There were many thoughts in his head. It seemed to him that the infected cells were going to his head. He could feel it. The guy had a feeling that the cells in his body were breaking out to the monsters. It was like a self-preservation instinct. The guy suddenly began to remember, various memories popping up in his head. Yeon-woo recalled running away from monsters on the Namsan cable car. He began to analyze what happened when the monster from the 3rd floor died and burned alive. Then the monster from the 2nd floor came right away. And when Jubin died, when a zombie monster that infected a friend burned alive, the creatures from below began to rush to him through the windows. He realized that the virus seemed to sense danger. He thought that maybe they were sending signals to everyone and trying to gather in a pack. Yeon-woo suddenly stood up. The teenager realized that if what he had realized was true, he could be the reason monsters appeared. So-yeon was shouting to her classmate that they had to go together. She asked if the boy realized what would happen if Yeon-woo was left alone. She was genuinely worried about her friend. She didn't want to let him down. Suddenly, Yeon-woo told them all to just leave. So-yeon's expression changed dramatically. She hadn't expected to hear that from the guy. He did not raise his head, looked at the floor, and said again that they all did not stop and just walked. Suddenly, the teenager raised his head and looked at So-yeon. Jeon-woo explained that he needed them all to leave, and then the boy would understand. He added one last time that the company should leave as soon as possible. He said something that broke So-yeon's heart. He said that he no longer needed their help. It turns out that he has now betrayed So-young. Hwang was very surprised and asked if the boy was serious. He asked if Yeon-woo was okay. The homeless man suggested that the teenager should just go with them, to which Jeon-woo replied that they should all go first, because the teenager wanted to go alone and be alone. Another homeless man pushed So-yeon and said that they didn't have time for idle chatter and they all had to run away as fast as possible. She did not understand what was happening and why Jeon-woo was pushing her away, but she just gave in and left with the homeless. Yeon-woo stood and waited for the company to move far enough away from him. He found a shop or a mini restaurant and sat down in it. He came in and immediately fell to the floor, exhausted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He saw his reflection in the dark screen of the phone and thought that he would take over now. The teenager thought that his mother must have been very worried about her son. Yeon-woo shook his head and thought about everything that had just happened. His mind was a jumble of thoughts. He did not know what he should do, because soldiers were chasing him and the guy was not protected from zombie monsters. They were all gathering around him, and inside the boy's body, the virus cells just grew. Suddenly, Yeon-woo broke down and started crying. He was so tired of it and of not understanding what was happening to his body. The thought flashed through his mind that he was going to die. The teenager sat in the corner of the mini restaurant and wrapped his arms around his legs. Suddenly, a soldier with an assault rifle in his hand walked by the establishment. As if on cue, he decided to see if anyone was inside. Through the glass, he noticed Yeonwoo sitting in the corner, looking down. It seems that the teenager had found a very bad hiding place, because he was found very quickly. Meanwhile, Park Min and Lee Tae-in were still being guarded by the military on the outside of the tent. His partner asked a corporal named Kim if the guy was really infected, and he got a response that the man himself did not understand. It seems the military was talking about Park Min. Meanwhile, the teenager was looking down and sitting on a chair. It was clear that Park Min was very concerned about something. It turned out that he was holding an empty pillbox. Lee Tae-in asked if it had worked. It seems that Park Min had taken the pill. Suddenly, the red-headed guy said it wasn't just a pill. It had a side effect. Park Ming raised his head and looked at Lee Tian. The teenager's face showed that he was very excited. Lee Tae-in said that it was not just a pill but a cure for cancer. He looked at Park Min. He liked that the teenager was scared. The red-haired boy could not stand it and laughed out loud, saying that Park Min was surprised. Lee Tae-in asked the teenager if he wanted to know why the boy was helping him. He didn't wait for Park Min to answer and said that the teenager had seen what was happening outside. Lee Tae-in commented that these soldiers were rich. He asked how they even had flamethrowers. He added that he had never seen one himself, but Park Min was still silent and did not get up. Lee Tian laughed again and asked if the teenager was scared. He asked if Park Ming knew what it was like to be really upset and broken. Lee Tae-in turned to look the teenager in the eye. The red-haired boy said that these soldiers were now their enemies. Park Ming suddenly thought. He needed time to think about all the words that Lee Tian had just said to him. Suddenly, the teenager heard the sound of a phone, someone calling his cell phone. Park Min picked up the phone and asked who he was talking to, because the number was unknown. The guy got up and walked away to talk. Suddenly, his gaze became excessive again. It turned out that he had received a call from Yeon-woo's mother. She knew Park Min's number because he had once lent his phone to Yeon-woo when he first entered the shelter. Meanwhile, Yeon-woo was still sitting in the mini restaurant, mulling over his thoughts that needed to be organized in his head. Suddenly, the guy decided to look up, and at the same time, he heard something. A soldier with an assault rifle ran into the mini restaurant and ordered Yeon-woo to quickly raise his hands in the air and not move. He suddenly realized that he was trapped. As he thought, he was going to be shot and die. The soldier asked what happened and why Yeon-woo was alone. The teenager did not raise his head, only stood up slowly and raised his hands. Yeon-woo was in no hurry to speak. Then, the soldier inspected the premises of the mini restaurant to find others who might be hiding somewhere. He couldn't find anyone, so he asked where everyone else was, but Yeon-woo still kept his head down and remained silent. The soldier asked if the teenager was going to answer him. The soldier picked up an assault rifle and pointed the muzzle at Yeon-woo. He shouted loudly at him again and asked where everyone else was, clearly threatening to shoot. But Yeon-woo answered simply and briefly that he did not know where everyone else was. He kept his head down and added that his friends had left alone, hinting that they had allegedly abandoned him. Meanwhile, So-yeon and two homeless men were running away. Suddenly, she heard a sound. It made her turn around. What she saw made her scared. Meanwhile, a gun was pointed at Yeon-woo. The boy looked down and said that all the others had died because of them. The teenager suddenly started shaking. He looked at his hand and it was shaking as well. It was not a good sign. The soldier said that Jeon-woo would have been better off answering seriously and not joking with him like that. The man asked again where Jeon-woo's friends were. Meanwhile, the boy knelt down and held his arms high. The teenager suddenly started asking the soldier for something. His voice was trembling. Suddenly, Jeon-woo raised his head and said that he really did not know where his friends were. The teenager was crying, tears streaming from his eyes. The soldier did not expect to see this. Jeon-woo covered his face with his hands and began to cry loudly. He begged the soldier not to shoot him. Jeon-woo looked so helpless at that moment. I wanted to feel sorry for him. The teenager twisted all over and almost fell to the floor. He begged every time for the soldier to have mercy on him and not shoot. The man was still pointing the gun at Yeon-woo. Suddenly, he thought about it. It was clear that the soldier was hesitating and did not understand what he should do, because he was still a child. Suddenly, the soldier lowered his weapon and cursed. Yeon-woo was shaking and still had his hands above his head, showing that he was afraid and wanted to protect himself. He called out to Yeon-woo and was already turning around. The man told the teenager to appear in front of him more often. The boy realized that the trouble seemed to have passed and sank completely to the floor, keeping his head down. Yeon-woo was breathing loudly and deeply, tears streaming from his eyes and dripping onto the floor. He could not believe that he had survived and had not been shot. Suddenly, the teenager felt something. He looked at the soldier. Suddenly, his tears all went away and the guy began to act quickly and actively. He saw something when the man was leaving the convenience store. Jeon-woo shouted for the soldier not to come out because it was dangerous for him, but the soldier did not understand why. Jeon-woo quickly began to look around for something. Suddenly, the teenager found something he was looking for. Meanwhile, the soldier stopped and turned to Yeon-woo to see what had happened and what was the reason for the commotion. The teenager saw the stove and screamed. The soldier looked at it all and did not understand what was happening and who this guy was. Meanwhile, Yeon-woo suddenly jumped up and ran to the stove. Suddenly, the soldier heard a familiar sound. It was the roar of a zombie monster. The man turned around and could not believe his eyes. In front of him stood a huge, ugly giant who was about to attack him. Meanwhile, So-yeon ran off somewhere. It seems that she changed her route because a homeless man ran after her and asked where she was going. Suddenly, the girl screamed Jeon-woo's name. She was so scared. She saw a street that was on fire. There were lots of flames coming out of different shops. The girl screamed. Meanwhile, the homeless man had already run up to her. The two of them stopped and watched the street burn. So-yeon suddenly screamed that there was a monster there too. It was lying on the ground and burning. Suddenly, the girl heard the sound of another monster. She turned toward the sound and screamed in fear. A huge zombie monster was flying at her. She and the homeless man were in danger. Suddenly, we heard fire from a flamethrower. The ugly zombie monster didn't have time to attack Seoyoung and Hwang because it was immediately burned. The girl and the homeless man sat down on the ground and covered their faces with their hands. They were very scared. So-yeon suddenly turned her head and noticed a uniformed soldier standing next to her. She was very surprised by this. She was looking at a man in uniform, pouring fire on a zombie monster and burning it alive. Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice shouting and asking why So-yeon had returned. She looked to where the sound was coming from. It turned out to be Jeon-woo. He was running with a burning flower pot in his hands to save his classmate. The guy took a swing and threw his bomb at the zombie monsters. Meanwhile, the soldier continued to fire his flamethrower. The burning flower pot flew straight at the monster. Jeon-woo was breathing loudly, shaking himself off. Sweat dripped down his face. He looked at the zombie monster burning. Suddenly, the teenager remembered who was behind him and whom he had just saved. Jeon-woo turned to So-yeon and started yelling at her. He said he told the girl to leave him alone. After that, the guy asked if So-yeon had come back to interfere with him. The girl almost started to cry. She was offended why Jeon-woo was yelling at her again. Why did everyone have to yell at her all the time? The girl suddenly said that she could not help herself. This answer surprised Yeon-woo. So-yeon looked down, didn't dare to look up, and said that all their classmates had split up and they were the only ones left. She suddenly began to list everyone. Kang-min and Isuri were no longer here. Kang Ji-hoon went to Namsan to look for Hon-mi. She continued that there was no guarantee that they would be able to meet them all. So-yeon said that she did not mind being called a hypocrite. Yeon-woo turned to her. This monologue struck him. So-yeon ended her speech by saying that he was now the only classmate standing next to her. She turned to look Jeon-woo in the eye and asked if it was natural for them to help each other. Suddenly, the soldier heard their conversation and reacted sharply. He suddenly asked about the Namsan Tower. The teenagers immediately turned to him. They were even shocked by what they heard. The soldier asked what his classmates had said about the Namsan Tower, that their friends were there and that they were heading towards the building. The man said that since the quarantine measures were taken around Seoul Station, then a small detachment was sent to the Namsan area. The soldier even took off his protective mask. He said that what they were telling him reminded him of something before the man came here. The soldier said that he had been ordered to help them in that area before. The teenagers immediately changed their faces after these words. He added that they told him they were looking for 2 people. The teenagers shouted that it was definitely their classmates. The soldier replied that in that case, they had all been helped long ago. He added that their friends were most likely safe. So-yeon listened to all of this and asked a question. She asked her husband if he had heard from any girls back then. But the soldier thought about it, scratched his beard, and said he knew nothing about it. So-yeon then apologized and asked if the soldier could tell her where the place was. The soldier looked at the girl with a stony face and said that if it was just a matter of location, he could tell her where it was. So-yeon screamed. She was glad to hear it. Suddenly, the girl stood up and bowed to the soldier and thanked him. But the man was a little embarrassed and said that the girl shouldn't have thanked him. Suddenly, So-young asked Yeon-woo if the boyfriend had heard it all too. The girl was very happy and said that they could meet Kang Ji-hoon, and if they were lucky, they would meet others. But Yeon-woo was not so happy. To be honest, he sat there with a stony face and simply said yes to So-young. The girl noticed this, and then her smile abruptly fell off her face. A military man interrupted their conversation and said that he was also about to join his team so he could help his friends. And then the Whig replied that he would, provided no one knew about it. He asked So-yeon if the fact that the children had escaped from the shelter could be a coincidence. Suddenly, the soldier turned red. So-yeon did not really understand what was happening, but it looked like the soldier was flirting with her. Jeon-woo decided to keep silent and not comment on the situation. So the company and the military man started running. A man was running ahead and told So-yeon that it was dangerous here, so they had to run after him and stay behind. The place was not that far away. So-young then looked at Jeonhwa, who was running beside her. The guy didn't look at her back, he just ran and didn't think about anything. But the girl was still worried about something, so she couldn't take her eyes off her classmate. Yeon-woo told the girl when they were still in the mini restaurant with the military man that she did not trust him. He explained that he meant for So-yeon not to count on him too much if they got into danger. Jeon-woo thought about what he had said as he ran. He thought that he had said the right thing, because he himself would have been in danger even if he had been alone. Jeon-woo thought that maybe it was because of Isuri that she reached out to him, but then he remembered that she had left him behind. The guy still thought that it was not so. He thought that maybe it was normal after all. Meanwhile, Kang Ji-hoon and Ji-han-hyun were in a room with light wallpaper. There was a grandmother sitting on the bed in front of them. They asked her if she knew where the girls were. She replied that she could only tell him the direction where the girls had gone, as she could only hear their footsteps. The soldier asked if the grandmother could have oriented them. She said it was about 2 or 3 hours ago. Everyone had already evacuated and she was the only one left. My grandmother began to recall how she was going to bed when she suddenly heard footsteps from running. She added that the girls were talking while they were running. The boy immediately asked what they were talking about. The grandmother said they were talking about Minji chasing them. The grandmother went on to say that the girls then ran in that direction. She added that the men should just try to follow. The woman asked if the military had evacuated people, and the soldier told her that they would take her to a safe place. Grandma thanked the military. Ji-han-hyun, meanwhile, looked at Kang Ji-hoon. The guy could not find a place for himself. He was so worried about his Honda. Suddenly, Ji-han-hyun put his hand on the boy's shoulder to support the teenager. He tried to reassure him that everything would be fixed as soon as reinforcements arrived. The guy looked at his friend and the man asked Kang Ji-hoon not to worry so much. Meanwhile, the soldier started talking on the radio to the headquarters again. He said it was the 2nd squad and they had an emergency. It turned out that the virus had spread inside. Most likely, the virus had spread in the shelter and they had to burn the place right now. Suddenly, the eyes of the military man sitting behind the wheel widened greatly and the pupils narrowed. He was scared. He saw his partner next to him, whose mask was filled with the virus. The soldier's eyes were not visible at all. There were 2 cars on the street, one of which was upside down. All the soldiers inside were infected. Meanwhile, other soldiers were looking for teenagers Isuri, Kang Min, and Ham Song-yu. The soldiers called the children rats and laughed at them. One of them suggested checking one alley between the buildings to see if there were any teenagers there. But it turned out that the classmates were looking out the window at the military. Isuri and Kang Min were not very careful about looking through the glass. The guy said that they were passing by with a relaxed air. He asked what they should do, and added that they must have already caught So-young and Yeon-woo. Ham Song-yu stood behind them and told them to get out of this strange place first. He added that the fate of these 2 was no longer their business. Suddenly, someone said that they had a lot of reasons to go rescue them. The guy's expression changed dramatically and became dissatisfied. It was Isuri. She said that even if it was dangerous to be around Jeonwoo, it would still be much safer with him. Ham Sung-yu swore when he heard this. He asked when the girl had started talking so much and added that they hadn't had much time to do so. He started to say what they needed first, but he didn't finish. Isuri interrupted him and asked who they were. The girl looked out the window and did not even turn to Ham Sung-yu. She asked if it was Isuri and them. Suddenly, Isuri turned to her classmate and said that she wasn't going to go with him. Ham Sung-yu was swearing at his classmate. Suddenly, someone spoke to him. Isuri asked if the boy believed that the girl knew nothing. She looked him straight in the eye. She suddenly said something that gave Ham Sung-yu goosebumps. She said she knew how she and Kang Ji-hoon had escaped from the Seoul TV tower. Meanwhile, the classmates, the homeless man, and the soldier kept running. The man told the group to hurry up and not to slow down. The soldier added that they were all very close. He said that very soon they could all meet their friends. A homeless man named Hwang was running behind the group. Suddenly he stopped and let out a loud laugh. So-yeon was the first to notice this. The man stopped completely and put his head down. It was obvious that Hwang was having a hard time running. Seo-young called out to him. She approached her husband and asked if he was okay. Then everyone stopped and approached the homeless man. So-yeon asked if it was probably because he had been beaten and cut by other homeless people. The soldier panicked. He asked in which area Hwang felt bad. He added that they were almost at the city already. The homeless man was screaming and holding his stomach. It was obvious that he was in pain. He said that his ribs were broken. The man added that he had been trying to hold on all this time. So-yeon felt so sorry for the homeless man. Hwang said he didn't think he could hold on much longer, and added that they would all be better off without him. Seo-young said that was not the case. She asked Hwang to go with them to a safe place. Meanwhile, Yeon-woo was distracted by something else. So-young and the soldier continued to persuade Hwang to go on, adding that they would go slowly, and that the man should try to get up. Suddenly, everyone turned their attention to Yeonwoo. The guy opened the door of a room next to them. The soldier shouted at him and asked why he did it. Jeonwoo said he was shaving to find some medicine. The soldier was outraged and told him to go back. So-yeon was also surprised by her classmate's action, but remained silent. Jeonwoo ran off somewhere. Suddenly, someone called his name and asked him to stop. So-yeon was there. She said that they had recently passed by a pharmacy. The teenagers made their way to the nearest pharmacy. There were many different medicines there. So-yeon asked which medicines they needed to take. The girl suggested looking for some painkillers. Jeonwoo agreed. Suddenly, the boy said he had found a shelf. So-yeon turned and looked at the boy. Jeonwoo said there were a whole bunch of them. Meanwhile, So-yeon suggested looking on the bottom shelf and sat down. She asked if people usually did not take Tylenol. Jeonwoo looked down at the girl but didn't have time to say anything. The guy suddenly heard something very strange. He abruptly covered So-yeon with his arm and told her to hide. Jeonwoo looked out the window to see what was happening outside. So-young did not understand anything. The boy cursed. In the window, he saw a zombie monster with brown hair and girl's clothes. It looked quite human. Perhaps the girl had changed recently. Jeonwoo said they must have been spotted. The zombie monster looked at the pharmacy and growled, as if to intimidate the victim. Yeon-woo came back and told So-yeon that they had to stay here until that horrible zombie monster left. So-yeon just looked at her classmate and agreed with his opinion. The teenagers were hiding behind the cash register table. So-yeon suddenly spoke up and asked if it wasn't the same as before, but Yeon-woo didn't understand what the girl meant. So-yeon explained that the way they were hiding reminded her of something. The girl said she suddenly remembered the incident on the cable car. Jeonwoo looked at her and listened attentively. His gaze suddenly turned stony again, and he turned away from the girl, saying that it was true. So-yeon felt uncomfortable with this pause. It was clear that she was a little embarrassed. She suddenly started asking why something like this happened, and why it happened to them at all. So-yeon wrapped her arms around her legs and suddenly remembered her classmate Gail and how she looked then. The girl was shaking. Suddenly, So-yeon started to cry, and said that she was looking forward to their school trip, wiping the tears from her eyes. Jeonwoo suddenly became imbued with the girl's feelings. He said he was also looking forward to this school trip. So-yeon did not expect to hear this. She looked at her classmate, but he turned away from her. He added that he had been looking forward to it and preparing for it. The guy looked out the window to see if the monster had left, but it was still near the pharmacy. Yeon-woo added that this virus was sporting everything. Suddenly, the zombie monster turned as if it had seen something. Yeon-woo said that if they touched on this topic, he would like to ask So-yinka a question. But before that, he asked if his classmate could answer this question honestly. So-yeon did not understand anything but asked what he wanted to tell her. It was clear that Jeonwoo was uncomfortable with the question. He was even a little afraid, but he started to speak, stuttering a little. He asked the girl if what his friend Kim Jubin had told them was true. Jeonwoo couldn't believe that his best friend had actually told them to leave him on the cable car. So-yeon did not know what to say to the boy. She began to speak. but the sentences were incomprehensible. It was clear that So-yeon did not know how to say it to him correctly. But by the way So-young reacted and spoke, Jeon-woo understood everything himself. The guy looked at the door and saw that the monster was nowhere to be found. It looked like he had left. Jeon-woo suddenly stood up to see where the monster was. The boy gave a short, "I see." So-yeon looked at the boy and felt so sorry for her classmate. Yeon-woo said he had been in such situations himself. He added that he understood Kang-min completely. He went on to say that he realized that fear made them weaker. Suddenly, the teenager wanted to justify his friend and said that Seo-young should have known what Kim Joo-bin was like. Yeon-woo's memory began to resurface when Joo-bin saved the boy by throwing a pot of flowers at the zombie monster. He told Seo-young that Kim Joo-bin was really brave at that moment, much braver than his classmates. So-yeon was genuinely moved by the story. She felt very sorry for Yeon-woo that he had been treated this way. The guy went to the shelf, took a painkiller, and said they should have come back. A few minutes later, the soldier said they were almost there. So-yeon and Yeon-woo held the homeless man on their backs and helped him walk. They all went to the burning cars. There was a soldier in front and others behind him. They did not dare to approach the burning cars. Hwang said that this was impossible, that the entire base was infected. The man asked what was going on here. There were indeed corpses of soldiers lying on the floor, all covered in white mucus and frog egg virus. The soldier saw this and cursed. He didn't even know about the case of his fellow soldiers. Suddenly, Jeon-woo saw something that caught his attention. There was a flamethrower on the floor that had not yet been set on fire. Meanwhile, the company had already reached the right place. The soldier ran first and stopped at an open door to a room. He turned to the others and was about to say that this was supposed to be the place, when suddenly he couldn't finish because he saw something very strange. Behind him ran Jeon-woo, who was carrying a fire extinguisher that the military had. It was obvious how hard it was for the teenager. Yeon-woo began to complain about how heavy the fire extinguisher was and how the soldiers carried it at all. The soldier cursed because he was annoyed that the teenagers were quite slow. He said that it looked like their friends were hiding somewhere inside the building. He added that they should look around the area. The soldier added that it was very dangerous to enter the building without any other support. So-yeon asked what about their friends. This question surprised Yeon-woo quite a bit. The girl said they had better just hope that they were okay. They had no choice. They didn't know what was inside. Suddenly, Yeon-woo refused to back up like everyone else. He ran straight into the building. A military officer noticed this and asked where Jeon-woo was going, shouting at him to have a mother. The guy said he had to see something. He wanted to check the condition of the inside. He thought to himself that he wasn't 100% sure, but Yeon-woo didn't feel that there were any infected people there. The soldier asked So-yeon if her classmate had lost his mind. He said the boy was doing whatever he wanted, but So-yeon herself was shocked by what had happened and what Yeon-woo had done. He ran inside, everything was on fire. Jeon-woo complained about how hard it was to breathe. It was very hot inside because of the large amount of fire. Yeon-woo said out loud that it looked like it was clear inside, but they were calling for help for a reason. He thought that there must still be some monsters left here. But the problem was that the structure of the building was very intricate, and Jeon-woo didn't know if he would be able to find them quickly. Suddenly, he heard some footsteps behind him. He turned around and saw So-yeon running toward him. The girl said she wanted to go with him. So-yeon ran to the boy and hid behind his back. Meanwhile, the military kept talking to the grandmother and waiting for reinforcements. Suddenly, another soldier came up to Yang Heng and told him to look after his grandmother, while the soldier wanted to go and finish the investigation. Ji Han-hyun approached Kang Ji-hoon and said that he heard his grandmother say that there were several exits in the building, so they had a chance to meet Kang Ji-hoon's friends. The guy thought about it and said no. Ji Han-hyun was surprised by this answer and looked at the teenager. The boy replied that they would definitely meet his friends. Meanwhile, another monster crawls in front of Yeon-woo and So-yeon. He was roaring and half-burnt and at times still burning. Jeon-woo immediately lit his flamethrower to kill the monster. The guy sharply pressed the switch, and a large amount of fire poured out of his flamethrower, which instantly burned the zombie monster. The teenagers watched as he burned and roared. Meanwhile, So-yeon hid behind a classmate. Yeon-woo commented that some of the monsters were still alive, but it looks like most of them are long dead. The guy said that he didn't think it was that dangerous in the building. So-yeon looked down in fear and said how relieved she was. The girl was almost crying from fear. She tried to show that she wasn't a coward and that she was doing some good, but that wasn't who So-yeon really was. She saw the head of a zombie monster on the floor, screaming in pain as it burned alive. Yeon-woo realized that So-yeon was not feeling well and told the girl that she could leave if she wanted to. He said it didn't make much difference if he was with her or not. Jeon-woo would still tell her when he found their friends. But So-yeon replied in a trembling voice and stammering that everything was honestly fine. Jeon-woo realized that she was lying, but decided not to expose her. They walked on. So-yeon said she was worried about where Kang Ji-hoon might have gone. Could he be hiding in one of those rooms? Yeon-woo supported the girl's opinion and said it sounded like the truth. He said he thought they would have been able to find him if they had followed that fire trail. Seo-young said she hoped so. She then asked if everything was okay with Kang Ji-hoon and the man who was with him. Jeon-woo exhaled a tired breath. And then he said that he had hoped for that as well. But then he added that if they found any problems, they would have to burn them with their own hands. So-yeon looked at her classmate in fear. She knew it was the right thing to do, but she had never thought about it, and the idea scared her. She looked at Yeon-woo and the way he just talked about it, as if he didn't feel sorry for his classmates at all. But suddenly, Jeon-woo's eyes fell down. He was thinking about something. He remembered how his best friend Kim Juba was burning, because it was actually Yeon-woo who set him on fire. He suddenly realized that he didn't want that to happen again. Suddenly, So-yeon told Yeon-woo to look to the side. The girl saw a soldier sitting on the floor in the corridor. Jeon-woo and So-yeon were shocked by what they saw. The girl asked if he had seen it too. Jeon-woo asked if it was a soldier on the floor. The teenagers ran up to the man. Yeon-woo said that the soldier did not appear to be infected. He then asked if he was one of the soldiers who had asked for reinforcements. Jeon-woo ran and asked if the soldier was okay. The man managed to look up and see the teenagers running toward him, but the man said that the teenagers were running away. Jeon-woo and So-yeon did not understand what he was talking about. The soldier said through the pain that he was a decoy. He wanted to lure people to their base and used the soldier as bait. Suddenly, Jeon-woo felt a shiver go through his body again. He felt the same pain again. The boy turned his head and saw something terrible. A big and huge zombie monster was coming out of the corner. It was the exoskeleton that Kang Ji-hoon and Jihan Hyun's military talked about. Jeon-woo was scared. His heart beat very fast. His eyes widened and his pupils narrowed. He realized that he had to do something and act immediately. Suddenly, he was again pierced by terrible pain. The guy tried to do something, but he couldn't. In front of him stood a huge, 3-meter-high, ugly exoskeleton, snarling at the boy. Jeon-woo screamed. He was very scared. He had never seen such big zombie monsters. Meanwhile, a soldier with an assault rifle was coming down some stairs. Suddenly, he looked up to see something. He did not understand the structure of this stupid building. The man took off his mask and said how stuffy it was. Sweat was running down his face. Suddenly, the man noticed something downstairs that caught his attention. It was an emergency exit. It was open, so someone was coming out of it. The soldier stood at the entrance and wondered if he should have gone inside as well. He wondered out loud why the boy in the cap had decided to go inside in the first place. The man felt that this city scared him very much. Meanwhile, the teenagers were in real hell. Seo-young screamed very loudly and even regretted going into the room with Yeon-woo. A huge monster stood in front of them and growled at their classmates. They had to do something fast. Yeon-woo stood there, staring at the exoskeleton like a man staring at a rock. It inspired great fear in the boy. Meanwhile, the zombie monster did not wait and opened its huge mouth to devour the teenagers. Yeon-woo saw this and his eyes popped out of his forehead. Its mouth was getting closer to Jonah. The monster had a large number of teeth. It looked like it was not one person but a merger of several zombie monsters. Jeon-woo closed his eyes and just waited for his inevitable death. Suddenly, he felt that the zombie monster had stopped and was not about to devour Yeon-woo. The guy was in a trance, looking at the mouth of a giant zombie monster. Suddenly, the boy's body and consciousness seemed to be transported somewhere else. Something very strange was happening to Jeon-woo. The guy seems to have realized that the zombie monster was reacting to the virus in his body. Jeon-woo realized that he had to do something, right now, at this moment. The guy pointed the muzzle of the flamethrower directly into the mouth of the zombie monster and lit the fire. Yeon-woo flipped the switch and fried the huge zombie monster. It roared in pain and was thrown back. Yeon-woo and So-yeon also fell backwards. The shockwave was too great. The girl looked at the huge exoskeleton burning in front of them, which no one had been able to overcome before. Jeon-woo could barely stand on his hands. So-yeon asked if the boy was okay because she had seen him being eaten by a zombie monster. The soldier behind them shouted for them all to run faster because they didn't have much time. He added that this monster was not as simple as it seemed. Meanwhile, the giant was indeed beginning to rise a little bit, as if what Jeon-woo had done was nothing to him. The soldier told the teenagers to run to the lower floor and added that soldiers from his base were also there. He shouted again for the teenagers to come to their senses and run away. So-yeon turned to Yeon-woo and told him to leave as well. She picked up her classmate and helped him to the shelter. So-yeon was not even afraid that Jeon-woo was infected. Meanwhile, the zombie monster was lying on the ground and growling. A soldier sat next to him and laughed at the monster. He called this ugly giant names and picked up a flamethrower. The soldier looked the zombie monster in the eye and asked him if he thought the soldier would let him walk away and light a flamethrower. Suddenly, the teenagers saw a fire and felt intense heat. Meanwhile, the teenagers were going down the stairs. Yeon-woo suddenly screamed as if he was in pain. So-young asked the boy what had happened to him and if he was okay. The classmate was genuinely worried about Yeon-woo. She stretched out her hand to help the boy not fall. He looked down and said that he was fine, and that they should get out of here. So-yeon tried to express words of support but was unable to finish. Something caught her attention. The girl saw someone sitting in the corridor. It seemed to be a girl because she was wearing a pink t-shirt. The teenagers looked in the direction of this man and were sincerely surprised. So-young noticed that it was Minju, her classmate, whom they were looking for. The girl ran up to her joyfully. She asked if Minju was okay and shouted happily. So-young couldn't believe it, that she had found her friend. She asked her classmate where everyone else was and said that only she and Yeon-woo were left. Suddenly, he felt something strange. Suddenly, he realized a terrible thing. The guy yelled at So-young to stay away from Minju. She stopped and turned to Yeon-woo, but she didn't understand what he meant. Yeon-woo shouted that their classmate Minju was infected and ordered So-young to come back to him as soon as possible. Unfortunately, the girl was one step away from Minju, and she even heard her classmate growling. She was making the sounds that zombie monsters make. So-yeon could not believe her eyes. She did not want to accept reality and just stood there, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, Minju turned to her. Her face was covered in white frog egg virus slime. She stood up to attack So-yeon. The girl had to react quickly, otherwise she would be eaten. But So-yeon could do nothing. She was afraid and stood there frozen. She could not believe that it was her classmate Minju. So-yeon suddenly remembered how she and Hanmi used to shoot videos for her channel. It was such a bright time. So-yeon was telling the camera about something. Suddenly, she didn't have time to finish because she was interrupted. Someone shouted to be given the floor as well. It was Kim Minju. She went to her friend and hugged her. She looked at So-yeon and said that they were close friends. But now, it was a horrible zombie monster. Its goal was to devour its own friends. Suddenly, in a second, Minju was already pouncing on So-young and growling. So-yinka ran fast. Yeon-woo yelled at her not to stand still. Yeon-woo also ran up to his classmate and burned Minju's zombie monster. Meanwhile, So-yeon hid behind him and turned away. The teenagers watched the corpse of their classmate Kim Minju burn. So-yeon put her hands over her face and started crying. She never expected this to happen to her friend. Yeon-woo watched and made sure that the zombie monster was burned. In fact, it hurt him to do it, but he had to, even though he didn't want to. Kim Minju's face was burning. Her classmate was dead. So-yeon began to cry a lot. It was as if something had just broken inside her. She returned to see what was happening there, but Yeon-woo stood in front of her and told her not to look at it. He blocked the picture with himself so that his friend So-yeon would not suffer from what she might see. It was not a pleasant picture. The corpse of a girl was lying on the floor. Because she was not completely transformed, she was easy to recognize. So-yeon leaned on Yeon-woo's back. The boy felt it and said that it would be better for her. He repeated that it would be better for So-young not to see her friend's corpse. He spoke from experience, as he still remembered Kim Jubin's corpse with horror.